California convictions, and I'm just doing my regularly scheduled live stream where I'm going to talk about anything related to prison that I can think of that I think people might want to hear that's in any way interesting or hopefully edifying. I said that I was going to focus, insofar as I'm able, on speaking about guys whom I knew. Goodness, that sentence was so garbled. I said I was going to focus, insofar as I'm able, on speaking about guys who I knew that were disabled and incarcerated. It is a difficult thing to be locked up in any circumstance, but to be locked up and to have a disability on top of that, it's an extra difficulty, and it can impact you in ways that people might not consider. For instance, if you have a disability that is obvious, maybe you're missing a leg or you're blind, well, you can't hide it. So you're setting yourself up for victimization, possibly. People are going to pick you out of a crowd and go, well, the blind guy is easy to pull away from the herd and possibly hurt. Additionally, if you have a disability that isn't obvious, you're not blind or missing a leg, maybe you have a limp that people can't really see but hurts whenever you put your foot down. Maybe you're prone to migraines and they're brutal, but it's not something you can prove. It's just that you're in a lot of pain, man. Well, you don't set yourself up for victimization because of your disability. But you do set yourself up for victimization, perhaps because of your lack of obvious disability. Somebody who can't keep up with everybody else, perhaps just through their mental infirmity, through whatever they have wrong with them, they're going to stand out from the crowd, and they're asking to be picked on, at least a little. Keep up, would. It makes sense to push up on a guy just a little bit whenever you want him to be a better example of himself. But if somebody's actually disabled, hi Arthur, then there's not much they can do to push harder. It's like having to go through boot camp for some guys. I was fortunate that I was young and healthy enough that I was okay. But I wouldn't have wanted to have to go to a real yard with a heart condition or something like that people didn't buy. They thought you were just using it as a shield. And I did see guys blaming their health. Just because somebody's disabled in whatever way does not mean they're an easy target. On the active yards, the GP yards, you didn't much see people getting targeted at random. It was very organized, very structured. On the SNY yards, where I did about half of my term, a little over, they just pick somebody and assault them or victimize them. It's not all the time, but it is the Wild West. There's not structure. You take care of yourself, and it's sink or swim in some ways, which I guess some guys thrive in and some don't. But if you're obviously disabled, you are likely to be pushed up on a little bit if you're trying to play the tough guy. If you're trying to mind your own business and not be bothered, there's a place for you. But I knew one dude, Samurai, and he had lost about that much right there of his arm in a car accident whenever he was running from the cops. And man, dude was tough. He'd do burpees all day. He'd get up and fight. I saw somebody basically step up to him, and the guy didn't blink. He came in and jabbed there with his stump and completely caught the guy by surprise, knocked him back, and then came in with a clean overhand right. The fight was over before it began, is what it looked like. Heck, just because somebody isn't young and has an infirmity doesn't mean they're not somebody to mess with. I saw a dude who got his TV stolen there in D Gym whenever I was there at SAD F. He took the footrest off of his wheelchair, went running up on the guy who he knew did it, and he didn't have proof, but I found out later he was right. Yeah, it was that guy. and went running up and tried to hit him in the back of the head with the footrest of his wheelchair, a big solid piece of, I guess, aircraft grade aluminum or what the heck they use on those chairs. And as I understand it, he missed the blow. The guy saw it coming and got the heck out of the way, because it is hard to run up on somebody when you're in a wheelchair. And then the guards came and de-escalated the situation. But it was a clean attempt at a murder from behind if he happens to hit the guy wrong. A piece of metal is a piece of metal. And I suppose they say, you can't take the prison out of the convict, and you can't take the convict out of prison. And there's some truth to that if there's somebody who's a killer, well, even though he got old, now he don't hear too good, and maybe he can't see, or heck, he got an injury somewhere along the way, and now he's missing a limb. That does not mean dude is to be trifled with, because some guys have nothing left to lose, and that's where they stand. I mentioned before one of my cellies, Wolf, and a good dude. He was, I thought of him as an old man at the time, but you got to understand, I was in my early 20s whenever I started this. I think he was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s. He had heart problems, though. Actually, he had something wrong with his ticker, and his veins were getting clogged up, and he had to go out to medical a couple of times. I thought of him as an old man, and I really was impressed with the way that he was ready to get down. I mean, there was no hesitation in his program. He was older, he was slower, but I mean, don't mess with him, because he was clear, I'm older and slower, and that means I can't fight. I'm not going to play around about what we're trying to do. We're trying to murder each other, right? And I got my piece. He's a good dude, but he was a killer. I suppose in some ways, the only real disability in prison, the thing that would make it so that prison was an environment you could not thrive in, is not being just a little bit of a sociopath. Everybody is playing that big, tough, I'm going to kill you if you get in my way card. Except the guys that lack the capacity, perhaps through a lack of conviction, perhaps through an intrinsic fear, whatever it might be, to puff their chest out. Or even if they try, they start hemming and hawing, and the lip quivers a little bit because it's just so scary to be up in front of the big man trying to stand up to him. That dude has a rough term ahead of him if he alienates the people that would generally stand with him. If first he goes SNY, and then from there, maybe he's a creepy guy, or he says the wrong thing at the wrong time and alienates people. Man, you're going to be victimized every stinking day. I was fortunate insofar as it went, and that even though I went to a serious prison when I started, High Desert, it's an okay yard. It wasn't brutal by any means. I mean, you went out and did your burpees every once in a while, and you went out in the snow and did work for the guards. It wasn't fun. Anybody who portrays that prison's a party or a blast went to a different prison than I did. But it wasn't miserable. I think the phrasing they use is cruel and unusual. There was none of that. There was fear, there was gangs, there were murders. But it was someplace that you could abide. I was lucky that I was sent there. There were men there who were, at least partially, disabled. Because High Desert had a good program for the vision impaired. Because High Desert had a good program for the vision impaired, meaning that they were able to go to the optometrist, and they sent out to the same lab anywhere in CDC. If you were an older cat and you had eye problems, if they could, they'd send you to High Desert, specifically B Yard, the yard I was on. That brought down like the level of crazy on the yard a whole bunch, just that one thing, that on the yard there's 30 or 40 older cats with vision problems. It doesn't sound like a lot on a yard of 1,000, but 30 or 40 old dudes with glasses, it does bring down the boiling point just a little bit. On the other hand, there at High Desert, they had the big shoe they've built. Z Unit, they called it. And so people came from all over the state because they got in trouble and then went to Z Unit because they were in trouble. That's the shoe. And they get kicked out. So sometimes you get the shoe kickouts there on our 270 yard, and that's a train wreck whenever it happens, because these are guys who are just going back to the shoe a lot of the time. They know what their time is going to be, and it's going to be stab somebody, do time in the shoe, stab somebody, do time in the shoe, get caught with drugs, do time in the shoe. I'm not saying it's the same thing every time, but if you're doing your time a certain way, you just accept that, yeah, you get in and out of the shoe every once in a while. It's part of the price of doing business. Additionally, if you had vision problems or hearing problems, you didn't just set yourself up with a potential for victimization by other inmates. Officers, many of them are cruel, vindictive men. And yes, absolutely, I saw mean-spirited or dangerous pranks and violent acts committed on guys that were disabled because they were disabled. I recall one inmate who, and to be fair, he was a scraggly old crepey dude. He's about 65 years old, looked like he hadn't had a shower since he hit the pen, and I'm not sure he was 100% in his right mind. Even though he was coherent, it seemed like he was a little hyper-emotional, perhaps. But he got into a yelling match with an officer who was notorious for being one of the guys that had been involved in the corporate shoe fighting, where the inmates had been killing each other for the guards' amusement. He went up and just put the wheelchair locks on the guy's brakes, and then picked up the back of his chair and flipped him. And the guy just about flew out of his chair and banged the back of his head and his shoulders and everything on the concrete. The officer got down in his face and explained to him how things really worked, in spite of what he might think were his interpretation of the rules. I suppose any act of violence against an inmate by an officer, it's intrinsically pretty one-sided. It's pretty awful. It's abuse. You don't need to beat the dude if you're holding the club and he's just standing there. There's no reason for it. The guy was just yelling. But it stood out as particularly vindictive and sadistic that the dude used the guy's wheelchair as prescriptive device, the thing he couldn't get out of, to hurt him with the specific intent of flopping him out of his chair so he'd have to crawl his way back to it, instead of smacking him across the back of the head or whatever he would have done to me if I had elected to get into a big yelling argument with him about the type of things you were allowed in a package. It's not easy having a disability of, gosh, any nature. I've mentioned vision and hearing impairments, but it's a hard path we all walk, and having to do it with that extra thing, it's a lot harder, in prison or out. But it did seem like the most important thing that I would get from other inmates whenever they were talking about their disability, whatever it might be, and whether they were viewing it, and I realize positive is not exactly correct, but positive light or a negative light, how they felt about having to endure prison with this added thing. I don't know that I met one guy that had an entirely negative attitude about it. And I suppose that, it's the penitent in penitentiary. It's that quiet time in the night where you just have to think about what you're in there for. Well, it seemed like they all had just a little bit more to think about due to their infirmity. Shelton Todd was curious how effective the treatment programs are at SADF. Well, in general, in CDC, treatment programs aren't great. The thing is that they used to call it CDC, the California Department of Corrections. And then come 2011 or so, they changed the name to CDCR, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. They legitimately took money out of a lot of programs to add the R on all of their forms and paperwork. I saw vocational programs get shut down to rebrand CDC as rehabilitation. That said, there are a couple of pins that have actual programs available, and SADF is absolutely one of them if you're on one of the yards that offer SAP programs. That's SAP programs. They substance abuse programs. And yes, I realize SAP program becomes a little bit redundant, but it is what they're called. SADF, as I recall, had it on a couple of yards, and they may have expanded it. My information is 6 years old at this point, even though I do know somebody at SADF. I would assume they've only increased in quality because there's a lot of money being funneled into CDC for programs like that. Woohoo! $10. That's exactly what it gets me as a burger. I'm happy to answer any dang questions. Thank you. It is... Gosh, I lost my whole train of thought because I'm so excited about that $10 donation. Thank you. I was trying to talk about being disabled in prison, both in general and specifically. I recall in reception, saw a dude not be able to keep up with the mandatory workout. I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I mean, he went white and he kind of dropped and... Heart problems aren't thought of as a disability, but he may well have known he shouldn't push too hard, and in a different environment he wouldn't have. I hope that over the course of his term he managed to get more healthy instead of less, but it remains that he wouldn't have went through it at all. It's like an enforced boot camp where they're going to push you to see where your breaking point is, and I'm sure there have been guys that fell out on a yard because they couldn't keep up. I told my most recent video about dude I was celled up with named Iguana. And I liked talking about him because in spite of the fact he had a serious anger problem, and he did, and it was okay. It wasn't like he was violent or aggressive. It's just he had a low level pissed off about him. That said, he was a good dude, and I never let him see his disability keep him down. He had a set of flashcards, 26 big pieces of paper that he'd set up because he couldn't hear the gossip on the tier. He couldn't yell out, "Hey, Frank, what's going on?" So his friend, who was not hearing impaired, would, if something came up that he knew that Lizard was interested in, something came up that he knew Iguana was interested in, and he'd call out, "Hey, dude," and he'd flash with his thing to get Iguana's attention, and then they would Morse code back and forth with these pieces of paper, T-H-A-T spells that, and so on and so forth, and talk for, God, hours. It was a little bit far for them to do the inmate sign language, which inmates are great on. They hold the hand up like this and do all the different sign language. It's one of the things that just about everybody is expected to learn if you're going to be an actual member of the gang. I never did, and I knew a little bit of Amslan before I went to prison, and I'm sure it's very similar. But it was just one of those things that it was a way of demonstrating, you were with the program. If you didn't know sign language, you're a NAC, is what they'd call you. NAC. NAC stands for Non-Affiliated Caucasian. It's a slightly derogatory term. That dude's not with the program. He's just a NAC. Don't trust him to hold your drugs. That's okay. It was within the rules to be a NAC. You didn't have to be there to be a high-powered, highfalutin, I'm a member of every gang, and if you were a NAC, it would absolutely drop you just that much on the social scale, and it's okay. That's their house, I suppose. Do all the gangs have the same sign language? What a smart question from Shaliste Girl. No. In fact, there's little changes that all the gangs make to the sign language that are purportedly secret to their gang. They are told, or at least they hope, that the information doesn't get out to other gangs, and then the other gangs try and know the little this or that trick. But it's not organized enough for your average run-of-the-mill, guy in a cell to bother knowing everybody's language, though many do have their own. It was not standard AMSLAN, American Sign Language. I can tell you, because I work back in the office, that however much effort may go into keeping all of the codes secret so the cops don't know, whatever. Dude, and thank you, Polaris, man. Right on. Another $10. That's a good night for me. If the cops get a kite that has all the secret codes in it, or they get video of doing the sign language, I happen to know for a fact, I talked to the squad guys, and then I'd tell the guys on the yard afterwards, they have all of that. They've kept track of all of the little codes that went from one yard to another that some guy made out of a book 4 years ago. Unless it's a single-use platen or something that's inherently uncrackable. Yeah, the cops already know all the secret codes. All you're doing is you're keeping it a secret from the other inmates. Covert communication amongst inmates is actually an interesting thing. There was an occasion where, and bear in mind that sometimes you'll end up being isolated from the other guys in your group, your race, just because that's where the tables happen to have cut off. Sometimes you'll have 3 guys of one group and 1 guy of another who all end up sitting down at a table together because they were standing that way in line. There's an occasion where I saw one of the more aggressive white power guys get stuck with 3 Hispanics on the other side of the table. And mind you, he was incredibly polite. But he did very politely say, "Could you guys not talk Spanish? Because I'm a little uncomfortable. I don't know what you're saying." And it was an interesting thing to wonder about, man. Because in his world, these guys are plotting to get him right then. And hey, maybe they are. It's a scary world. I'm happy to read some comments. Shelton Todd asked, how do Asians, non-Americans, and others fare in the system? And Arthur D. asked about SADF. I've always wondered if it's not impolite to ask. Was I there for substance, and if so, which one? I'll answer both of those. There is an Asian car, and there is an other car, though there's others sometimes run and is a big other car, and sometimes Asians run in their own car. Sometimes there's a Polynesian other car. It really depends on the exact demographics of a yard. But because there's not generally a whole bunch of others on a yard, it can be difficult for them. And it's often guys that have joined together just, well, if there's enough of us in a group, people won't bother us. There are guys who could have been members of any group, but rather chose to run as other. I didn't see any real discrimination, as it was hard to do time as any specific ethnic group, though there are some that stood out as running good programs that it really seemed like they looked out for each other. And I suppose part of that is being a small group in adversity. As for why I was sent to SADF, it was because whenever I left High Desert, which had been a serious yard, I guess is what you say, I did an evaluation, and they were considering me for a whole stupid debrief. It was going to be a year back in the placement management unit. I was going to have to do interviews with gang task forces and keep repeating, I don't know what you're talking about. This is absurd. I wasn't a member of anything. Because I really wasn't. They were considering just doing it as a test program. And I was going to be one of the first guys that they were just going to put through the ringer because I went through the program at that time period, and they were considering running everybody through the ringer in that time. An acquaintance who had spoke on my case, and it's a complex story, Tom Cahill, wrote a letter to the warden that was read during my interview, and he had a small amount of political clout. As a result, I was sent to a good yard, someplace that was considered a place where you could get some rehab done, I guess. and that was Sat F. Most of the other guys there, as much as it may have been purported as a place you get good rehab, it's a safe place, most of the other guys there were creeps. This was a place set aside for people that couldn't be most other places because they'd get assaulted. And to a lesser degree, people like me who just were going to mind their own stinking business because they didn't have anywhere to go. The broader question as to whether I have a substance abuse problem, I don't. And I've done, God, I think most of the major drugs at one time or another. I was in prison. But I never had the appeal. I don't understand the I will build my life around this particular substance. There are so many better things to do. And I guess I'm just fortunate that it didn't crawl in my head the way that it did some people's. I did want to note that in the near future, I intend to be reaching out to a couple of other channels about getting some interviews done. And hopefully, I'm going to be expanding my audience base just a little bit. I'd like to start doing occasional videos talking about cases. I remember I did a video about the Shane Goldsby case, and I know I bring it up a lot. It's stuck in my craw in a specific way. It got under my skin. But I'm going to try and start doing a short format where I'll talk about somebody's case and how much time they got. And I'm additionally going to be doing more live streams, hopefully. Perhaps just a little bit less pre-recorded content. I've got a lot going on right now, and I really enjoy being able to talk to y'all in whatever format you'll have me. I was planning on about a half hour for this live stream, and I'm near the end of that, but as always, I'd like to give anybody who has the interest, whatever you want to toss out, go ahead, I'll talk about it. Thanks, Arthur D. I'd love to be interviewed on other channels, and I do expect you will be. I'll make an announcement sometime not too long from now. I suppose I'll wrap up. I like to come back around some point of edification about what I've talked about. And I just wanted to say that all these dudes that I met while I was incarcerated, whether it was Samurai, he was a tough man, he was a hard man, he's missing a chunk of arm right there. Or it was, Wolf, who didn't have a specific infirmity, it's just he was an older dude and his body was giving out on him. Well, they were still hard, scary men. You didn't want to mess with them. That's not the same thing as being somebody who should be admired. But they held on to the strength of their convictions. They still really believed the things they did, even through infirmity, disability. We all have that opportunity to take things that, they stink. You get dealt a bad hand. And turn it around. Use it for something good. I don't know when and I don't know what, but if you have the opportunity to do that, to take something that's just a little awful and make it just a little okay, well, don't hesitate to. It's your life, right? I want to thank everybody for listening, and I really will be a little bit more vigilant in getting some interviews and getting my live streams out there. Have a good evening.